Hi, this is Dr. Molly Gebrian, and this is the first video in a series on preparing for memorized performance. So this first video will talk about the different types of memory, and then also we'll get into the first stage of memory, which is called encoding. The subsequent videos will talk about the other stages of memorization. So when we think about memory, we think of it as one thing, right? I have a good memory, I have a bad memory. But actually, there's many different types of memory that our brain uses on a daily basis, and they all work together in such a seamless way that our perception of them is that they're one thing. But we know that they're actually separate types of memory because they can be damaged separately in people that have brain damage. So the first type of memory that I want to talk about is what's called explicit memory, or sometimes declarative memory. Those are synonyms in this case. And this is what you think of when you think of memory. So explicit memories are like your memory for facts, like George Washington was the first president of the United States, or your memory for things that happened to you. So what did I eat for breakfast this morning, right? That's called an explicit memory, a declarative memory, a memory that you can verbalize and say, yes, I have a memory of this. On the opposite side of that is something called implicit memories. And the most common example of this is what we as musicians call muscle memory. So like they say you never forget how to ride a bike, that's because it relies on muscle memory. But there are implicit memories that are not strictly muscle memories. So for instance, most people's knowledge of their native language largely relies on implicit memory. If somebody who is learning, in this case English, ask a question, well, why do you say it that way? And you say, I don't know, you just do. That's how you say it. Because our memory for how our language is constructed is implicit. We know what it's supposed to be, but we can't actually say, like, oh, here are the rules, unless we've studied that. Okay, so implicit, explicit memory, those are two kind of different types of memory. There are also different types of memory when it comes to time scale. So you've probably heard of long-term memory and short-term memory. So long-term memory is our memory for things that, happened a long time ago. Long-term memories are very resistant to breaking down, that you have essentially unlimited capacity for forming new long-term memories. Short-term memory, on the other hand, is if I told you my phone number right now and I said, okay, you have to memorize this, but you're not allowed to write it down. And so you'd say it over and over in your head until you got to a place where you could write it down. That's short-term memory. And short-term memory has a very limited capacity, and it's very prone to breaking down. So if I told you my phone number and I said, okay, make sure you remember this, but you can't write it down, and you were repeating it to yourself, and then somebody burst into the room and announced some, spectacular event that had just happened, when they left, you probably would have forgotten my phone number because it was disrupted by the person coming and making the announcement. There's also something called working memory that's really important to our discussion today. So working memory is like short-term memory in that it's something that you're actively holding in memory. But unlike short-term memory, working memory is something you use when you're actively manipulating that thing that you're holding in memory. So for instance, if I were to tell you my phone number and say, okay, remember my phone number, but also add up the digits and tell me what that adds up to, that would rely on working memory. And you can imagine how taxing that would be, right? Remember the numbers, but also add them up at the same time. And we know that working memory is very taxing on the brain. It also has limited capacity, just like short-term memory, and it's very prone to breaking down under pressure. And so we really do not want to be relying on working memory when we're performing from memory, because we're going to be under pressure. What we want to be relying on is long-term memory. Okay, so to make sure that you really understand what working memory is and what it feels like to use it, we're going to do a working memory task that's used often in the lab to test working memory. So this is called the NBAC task. And the way it works is that you are going to see a series of pictures, they're cute little animals, and your job is to say if the picture you are currently looking at is the same as 2 pictures ago. So you're only going to see one at a time, and you have to remember what was the picture 2 ago. So as an example, you might see this cute little penguin, and then he'll disappear, and maybe you'll see this bee. And then if you saw the penguin again as the next picture, the answer would be yes, it's the same as 2 ago. So for the first 2, you can't say anything, right? Because there's not 2 ago. But after that, as you see the pictures, just answer for yourself, yes or no. Is it the same? So here we go. So how did you do? You can see that it's taxing, right, to do that. And had you been under pressure, like if there was somebody standing right next to you watching your performance and that was going to be used to determine your scholarship at school or your job performance or something like that, probably you would have done worse because you would have been under pressure. And so we really don't want to rely on working memory when we're on stage. We want to make sure we're relying on long-term memory because it's very stable, especially under pressure, and it essentially has unlimited capacity, like I said. So now let's turn to the different stages of the memorization process and learn how we can do better at each one. There are 3 different stages to the memorization process. The first is called encoding. How do you get the information in your brain in the first place? The second is called consolidation. How do you take that information and get it into long-term storage? Because when it first comes in, it's just in short-term storage. And then the third step of the way is called retrieval. So how do you get that information back out again when you need it? And if any one of these 3 steps, so encoding, consolidation, retrieval, if any one of them is weak or not practiced enough or not done well in some way, you are going to have difficulty getting the information back out again when you need it. So let's look at the first part of this process, encoding. So how do you get the information into your brain in the first place? We know that when you engage in something called deep encoding, it helps really get the information to stick in your brain. So to illustrate what I mean by deep encoding, I'm going to use a classic experiment on encoding. It has nothing to do with music, but just to illustrate the point. So with this experiment, they had people come into the lab and they were shown words on a screen. One of the groups, when they saw each word, they had to supply a definition. The other group, when they saw each word, all they had to do was say what the last letter of the word was. Then after both groups had done these tasks, then they were asked to write down as many words as they could remember. So this was basically a pop quiz. They had no idea they were going to be asked to do this. They just had to write down as many words as they could remember. And what they found is that the group that had defined the words remembered and was able to write down far more words than the group that just supplied the last letter. This makes sense in terms of deep encoding because the group that had to define the words, they had to read the word, they had to connect it to information they already had stored in long-term storage, and then they had to come up with a definition. This is what is meant by deep encoding. They engaged with the information, in this case the word, on a very deep level. The other group that just had to say the last letter of the word, their encoding was very shallow. They didn't really have to engage with the word at all. They didn't even have to read it, much less think about what it meant. So we know that one of the most powerful encoding techniques is something called chunking. You may have heard this before. Chunking basically means taking separate pieces of information and putting it together in a packet, sort of, that's one piece of information that all sort of belongs together. So to illustrate chunking, we're going to do another little experiment. So in this one, you are going to see a series of letters appear on the screen. And when they do, I want you to commit them to memory as quickly as you can. They're only going to be there for a few seconds. And then once they disappear, I want you to write down as many as you can. If you don't have something to write with, pause this and go get something. You will get more out of it if you actually do this example. All right, so when I say go, some letters are going to appear on the screen for a few seconds. Commit them to memory, and then when they disappear, you can write them down. All right, ready, set, go. Okay, now you can write them down. Okay, let's do another set of letters. So same thing, you're going to see some letters. Once they appear, try to commit them to memory. Once they disappear, then you can write them down. All right, ready, set, go. Okay, now you can write them down. Okay, so the second set of letters should have been easier than the first because the second set can be chunked into 3 acronyms. So CIA, USA, FBI. These are acronyms that most people already know. You know what those letters stand for. You know what the CIA is. You know what the USA is. You know what the FBI is. So you can connect those letters to information you already have stored in long-term memory, so it's much easier to remember. Incidentally, the first set of letters was just the second set backwards. So not only are they exactly the same length, they're actually exactly the same letters. But the second set was much easier for you to remember because the information is chunked. It's 3 pieces of information rather than 9 pieces of information, and it's information that already has meaning for you that you can connect to your long-term memory. So as musicians, when we're trying to learn something that we're going to perform from memory, it's really, really important that we chunk the information as much as possible. If you are memorizing individual notes, individual rhythms, individual bowings or tonguings or whatever it is, it's going to be much, much more difficult than if you can chunk that information together into packets of information. This, incidentally, is why we practice technique. It's also why we take theory and oral skills class. So when you practice technique, scales, arpeggios, the types of things that we do when we practice technique, etudes for different skills, you are essentially learning to chunk that information, both in terms of declarative memory information, like, okay, I know that F sharp major has 6 sharps, rather than remembering, oh my gosh, F sharp, C sharp, what's the next sharp, right? You don't have to remember all those. If you know F sharp major is 6 sharps, everything except for B sharp, right? B is the only one that's natural. So, and then when you practice an F sharp major scale or a D major scale or whatever, you are forming a muscle memory chunk for that information. So when you're a beginner and you learn your first scale, it can be hard to remember, right? What's the fingering for this? What comes next? But once you attain a certain level of proficiency, D major scale or F sharp major scale is one chunk. You don't have to remember every single note in the scale and every single individual fingering. You just remember, oh, that's how I play this scale. It's one chunk of information. Similarly with music theory and oral skills. So one of the things you learn in music theory is that the most standard progression is tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic, right? 1, 2 or 4, 5, 1. And so when you are playing something that has a standard progression like that, you don't have to memorize every single chord. You just know, oh, right, this is a standard progression. And you don't have to think, okay, 1, 4, 5, gosh, what comes after the 5 chord, right? You just know it's a tonic chord. And so it's much less information for your brain to have to hold in place because it's together in a packet of information rather than lots of separate pieces of information. So if you're trying to memorize something right now, I encourage you to figure out, okay, how can I look at this sort of more big picture? How can I take this information that's on the page and put it into packets of information? Because that will make it much easier for you to memorize. I want to take a look for a moment at this graphic, which comes from a study that was done in 2013 that basically took a whole bunch of studies looking at chunking and what happens as somebody attains more expertise in a certain thing. So they had golfers and chess players and all sorts of different experts in different areas. And they wanted to look at what happens in the brain as somebody gains expertise. So if you look at the left-hand side of this picture, at the top, it's showing recall dots on a matrix and recall these 7 letters. So those are their examples of things that you're gaining more expertise in doing that you're going to have to do from memory. And when people start practicing something, so they're a novice, they have no chunks yet. And what you see is that the activity in working memory areas of the brain is very high. That's in the bottom part of this graphic, in the sort of brownish, greenish part, where it says activity and working memory in WM areas. And you can see that the bar there is really big. That means a lot of activity in the brain. Right under that, you can see the activity in long-term memory areas. That's the LTM. And you can see there's hardly any activity at all. And so like I said at the beginning, we really don't want to be relying on our working memory when we're doing something from memory under pressure because it's going to break down. But when we're brand new to something, we don't have any chunks, so we really have to rely on working memory. As we practice more and get better, we start to group things into chunks. So if you look at the top on the matrix, they've grouped the little dots into 3 groups, and they've grouped the letters into 3 groups as well. And what you see during this stage is that activity in working memory areas is still there, but it's lower, and that you have some activation in long-term memory areas. So we're getting there. We're getting where we want to be. As you gain expert level, you start putting your chunks together in what I call super chunks, but they're actually called knowledge structures, but I like super chunks. So if you look at the top, those 3 chunks they made in the matrix, it's now one big super chunk. And the letters are also one big super chunk. And once you have these big knowledge structures, what you see is that activity in working memory areas goes way down, whereas activity in long-term memory areas goes way up, which is exactly what you want. I think that one of the most important but also most basic chunks that we can have as musicians is key signatures. I remember when I was growing up and I would play something in A flat major, heaven forbid, that felt like so many flats to me back then. I could not remember the D flats for the life of me, and I would have to write them in for every note. If you're performing something from memory and the key signature is not ingrained in you that, like, of course you're going to have D flats and A flat major, you constantly have to remember, oh gosh, I have to play D flat here. That's excess information that your working memory is having to hold on to, that if your key signatures were well embedded, that you wouldn't have to do that. Similarly, for any accidentals that you have, if you understand why that accidental is there, okay, we've modulated, it's the leading tone in the new key, you're much less likely to forget it. And also, it has a place in a larger knowledge structure, a larger super chunk. And so it's less information for you to hold on to. So I know that when you take theory class, this is one of the things you do freshman years, you learn all your key signatures and it feels like such a pain, like who cares? Like it's going to be written on the paper anyway, like I don't care. But it really, really, really makes things much easier for your brain if key signatures are just a super chunk that you have, so you don't have to hold on to that excess information of which sharps and flats do you have. Okay, I want to turn now to the research of Roger Chaffin. He was a psychology professor, now retired, at the University of Connecticut, and he did a number of studies where he partnered with professional musicians who were preparing for memorized performance. And so what he would do with these musicians is he had them videotape every moment of their practicing from the very first day they started practicing something up through their memorized performance of that piece. And so he had them document the whole learning process. He had them sort of like reality TV style, like talk to the camera while they were practicing and sort of verbalize like what they were doing and why they were doing it. He also had them keep a practice journal, kind of keeping track of this information as well. And so when they were finished, he took all of this data, so all these hours of practice videos, all of these pages of practice journals, and he analyzed them to see what people said they were doing and what they were actually doing. And what he found was that one of the things that all the musicians did is that they had what he calls different performance cues, which is information from the music itself that they were using to help them remember the notes that were on the page and to link those notes to some broader framework to help encode that information into their brain more securely. So let's go through these different performance cue types. The first kind of performance cue that he identified what he calls structural cues. So these are, the formal structure of the piece. So, the beginning of the development section or right after the first repeat or something like that. You don't have to have had formal music theory training to do this. So in the Suzuki method, the first song that kids learn is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and it's always presented or often presented as a sandwich. So the first section is the bread, then there's 2 little parts in the middle that are 2 pieces of cheese or meat or whatever the kid wants, and then the final section, which is the same as the first, is another piece of bread, right? So the structure is presented as a sandwich rather than ABA, for instance. So knowing where you are in the structure. His second performance cue is what he calls expressive cues. So this is the happy part. This is the sad part. What emotion are you trying to express to the audience? His third cue type he calls interpretive cues. And at first I was like, interpretive cues, expressive cues, like that seems the same thing to me. But what he means by interpretive cues are things that the composer themselves wrote in. So changes in tempo, changes in any sort of like big markings that the composer puts in to change tempo, affect, whatever. And then the final type of cue he calls basic cues. So these are matters of technique. So fingering, bowing, tonguing, slurring, pedaling, whatever. So he found that the musicians he worked with, all of the different cues, the information that they used to link what was on the page to this broader framework to secure it more securely in their brain, fell into these 4 different categories of different cues. The other thing he did was 1 year to 18 months after the study was over, he would contact these musicians completely out of the blue, and he would say, oh, remember that piece you learned from me? Get out a piece of staff paper right now and write down as much as you can from memory. Can you imagine you haven't thought about a piece in like a year and a half, and this guy calls you up and asks you to write it down on a piece of staff paper? So anyway, they had to write down as much as they could, notes, rhythms, articulations, dynamics, whatever, and then send it to him. And then he would analyze what they were able to remember and how did that map onto these performance cues that they had set up in their initial learning process. And what he found was that the most durable cues, those that were still cueing recall for the actual notes and rhythms over this period of a year to 18 months, the most durable cues were expressive cues and structural cues. So where are you in the piece? What are you trying to express? He found that the weakest cue was basic cues. And in fact, basic cues he called negative cues because they seem to promote forgetting. This was really interesting to me because it seems to me, so again, basic cues are matters of technique, fingering, bowing, articulation, how you're going to do articulations. And, it seems to me if you're remembering the specific bowing or the fingering, that would help cue recall of the note better, but he found the opposite. So I thought that was really interesting information. All right, that's the end of this video about encoding. So the next stage of the process, consolidation, is in the next video. So I hope you will join me over there to learn about that. Thanks for watching.